My American Studies 340 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 7 in this course, and we're moving into the next phase because presumably all of you will have already or sometime during this week for the most part handed in your research project proposals. I will try to ungrade all of these, give you advice, make suggestions as to how to proceed by the end of this week 7. So that's one thing. You got one other thing to look forward to for not this week, but for next week. Well, we will not formally have classes for week 8. It's built into the schedule already to give you the week off from having to do another set of readings, be prepared to talk about them in terms of discussion, dialogue, small groups, whatever else I would expect normally for you to do over the course of the week, so that you have time to work on what would be essentially the first draft of your executive summary and the first draft of what would be your research paper for this course. Um, Keep in mind, those things are just drafts. They don't have to be complete. There can be sections that are not done. We'll talk about that more when I put up a video for week 8. We won't meet for week 8, but I'll still do a video for week 8 specifically on expectations for your first draft, which I believe is due the 25th. Yeah, the 25th of October. So that's me jumping ahead. But anyway, so this week is really about the fundamentals around the role of class within the mix of education and racism at the K-16 level, both for kindergarten through high school and at the college level. And so the readings for this week primarily are distributed around how different groups experience social class discrimination or privilege in the context of education, whether those groups have to be Hmong or Chinese, African American, uh, you know, or Native American, really, right? You could throw pretty much any group in this mix. I try to give you a diverse enough set of readings to try to cover the experiences or as many students of color, families of color, Americans of color as possible, including a reading written by yours truly. This one was written for The Atlantic about 4 years ago. It's about my own personal experience as a poor first-generation college student. And even though the experience pretty much comes out of the late 1980s, it's still applicable to what many students experience and are experiencing in the late 20 teens and now 2020. Although obviously the pandemic has added to that mix. And so really it comes down to this is sort of a summative midway point within the course in a lot of ways, right? We've talked about the history of racism in education vis-a-vis Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, vis-a-vis Latinx folk, vis-a-vis Black folk, vis-a-vis Asian Americans over the course of the last 6+ weeks now, right? So now it's sort of summative. Here are articles that definitively deal with social class and how social class is important. And again, I'm just reiterating a few things around this. Articles like books like Christopher Jinks's Inequality, which is listed in your supplemental reading list in the syllabus, and Jeannie Oakes's book Keeping Track, also in the supplemental reading list of your syllabus, and so many other things that you're reading. And Lou's book, which you're finishing up for week 6 on Asian Americans in education, are all dealing with this issue on some level that the education system has a tendency to reproduce class divisions, to reproduce inequality, socioeconomic inequality, which is to say the system set up through testing, through ability grouping and tracking, through how resources are distributed between poorer neighborhoods and richer neighborhoods, the way taxes dollars are distributed along those lines, so many other things that set up so that if you are middle class, you will come out of the system more than likely ready to go to college able to go to college, more comfortable going to college, and more likely to graduate from college and have the career that produces middle class and affluent levels of income. If you happen to be of a background that in which you lived through poverty growing up, you're less likely to to finish high school, less likely to think seriously about college once you finish college, less likely to be comfortable if you are going to college, less likely to complete college, less likely to get the same level of income upon finishing college because you lack the social networks necessary to end up automatically taking a job in which you receive a middle class income or an income that helps you produce affluence. That's just a fact. And so all of these articles, all of these readings, yours truly is included, really hit at all the different barriers between a first generation student who more than likely is grown up in working poor, working class, welfare poor, or worse kinds of socioeconomic situations, and all the barriers that are there socially, culturally, academically, financially, um, even spiritually on some level, physiologically, because, lack of food, lack of sleep, all those things have an impact on one's health in terms of your ability to do well in school and to use that, you leverage the few aspects of schooling that are semi about merit in order to get into college in the first place. That's what all these readings basically are dealing with. So really, it's just sort of like a summative where we are at this point in terms of understanding education, right? Is it a form of social control? Is it a form of social equality and liberation? It's both, right? I think the conclusion at this point that can be reached safely to say is that it's both and at the same time. But it's disproportionately and primarily meant to be social control. The real question is, the real question is, looking at the authors that you're reading this week, the key question to ask yourself while you were doing the readings of Louis and doing readings of Adrian Keene and reading my stuff from the Atlantic and reading Stacey Lee and reading the last couple chapters of Jamie Liu, right? The real question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about this system? What do we do about a system that's primarily about social control that has sort of grafted onto itself pieces of liberation and meritocracy and let's try to be equal and let's try to create situations where students who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can do better, all that other BS, right? What do we do about it? I think we know more about what we shouldn't do than what we should. The ideal would be, well, why don't we just spend as much money in public schools as parents spend to send their kids to private schools, right? Parents spend upwards of $50,000 a year sending their kids to, in this area anyway, in the DC area, Sidwell Friends, where Obama's kids, Malia and Sasha went, and by the way, Chelsea Clinton went to in the 90s. Georgetown Prep in North Bethesda, not that far down from Walter Reed Hospital. I'm sure you guys have heard about that this over the last few days. Some of these other schools, these prep schools, these private prep schools cost $40,000 and $50,000 a year to go to. I mean, really, you're basically spending college money for your kid to go to a high school. Um, and across the board, the average expenditure per pupil in the United States is somewhere in the low tens, like around $14,000 a year. You hit a high of about $19,000 a year in New York and Los Angeles, and lows still below $10,000 a year in states like Mississippi and Alabama. We're hardly spending any money on these kids. And when you throw in the fact that that money is not equally distributed. That's per pupil by state, right, or by city, and it's not equal by even by neighborhood in some cases in some of these school districts, and forget about by state, right? You throw in that fact. You throw in the fact that a lot of major cities now have to deal with charter schools and have to split their public funds with charter schools who are able to select who can go to their schools and who can't go to their schools. So if you live in DC, 44% of DC's school budget goes to charter schools, who only have about 39% of DC's school population, which means there's disproportionately more money going to public charter schools, which have no sort of obligation to the public whatsoever. They have their own school board. They have their own leaders. They're not beholden to the mayor. They're not beholden to city council. They're not beholden to really anybody. Versus the other 56% of income, 56% of total expenditures going for 61% of school population. And then you throw in the fact that DC also has to deal with everybody, including students who have disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. They have a school set up just for those kids. On a pure pupil basis, they're spending about $115,000 per kid at those schools for students who specifically have severe disabilities, right? Cerebral palsy, can't walk, type 1 diabetes, who, according to the scale, might have some form of mental illness or mental deficiency that means that they can't be mainstreamed at all. You know, severe autism, etc. That's why it costs so much, because you need specialists to do that. So when you take that all into account, DC's not really spending $19,000 per pupil. It's spending probably more like $10,000 or $11,000 per the average pupil going through the school system. So how do we deal with that? There are definitely answers for how to deal with it. Why won't people do that is really the question. Also, the second question that you need to ask in terms of the experiences that people from various backgrounds of color and white who happen to be folks who lived with poverty have gone through over the years in the school system that we have now. So that's what you're really looking at in doing these readings, right? Louis and Stacy Lee and me and Adrian Keene and other folks. But the other thing to be looking at in terms of socioeconomic disadvantages and haves and have-nots and social control and all that, in terms of what we do about it, is what we need to do about versus what we're able to do at this moment. Adrian Keene describes an approach that deals with issues of culture, specifically cultural appropriation to Native Americans. Jamie Liu talks about solutions as well, in terms of how do we deal with the model minority issue and how do we correct it so that we're not depriving Asian American kids who happen to be of from lower income backgrounds of a type of education that richer Asian American kids automatically get because of their parents' income, because of model minority expectations, and so on and so forth. Even things that I propose in my own writing in terms of how do we deal with students once they get to college, assuming they even get there, right? Those kinds of things. There are no easy solutions to any of this, by the way, and you know that. You guys all know that there are no easy solutions because people don't want to give up power. They don't want to give up money. They don't want to give up and be completely altruistic in enabling folks who come from who have lived with poverty all their lives to have the opportunities that rich kids have, that middle income kids have, that affluent kids have in terms of quality of schooling, quality of teaching, quality of textbooks and curriculum, quality of community for that matter. No one wants to give that up, and these are large systemic issues that no one really wants to deal with in any way, shape, or form. And so your projects are going to be a reflection of that reality that social control is in schools are not necessarily one-to-one. It's not complete causation, but very close, probably a 0.6 on the +1 scale, right? More, that that destiny is really the thing that's in place here in terms of how people do and don't do well in school, well in education. So we'll talk about these articles. I'd like to get to talk about the Michelle Rhee video on the education of Michelle Rhee, because I think this is also part and parcel talking about possible solutions and why the solutions that people propose oftentimes refuse to give up not even an iota of power. She is key to understanding all of that. So, thank you all. This will be the last recording before we take a break. So,